Welcome to a gentle journey through the pages of history, where we explore the fascinating and sometimes startling personal habits of European royalty. Tonight, we delve into the lives of 7 monarchs whose relationship with cleanliness was, shall we say, rather complicated. As we drift through these tales of bygone eras, let the soft rhythm of history carry you into peaceful slumber. In the grand tapestries of royal courts, where gold thread gleamed and silk rustled in candlelit halls, there existed a paradox that modern minds might find difficult to comprehend. These were individuals who possessed unlimited wealth, commanded vast armies, and lived in palaces of unimaginable luxury. Yet many harbored a profound aversion to what we would consider basic hygiene. Their stories unfold like whispered secrets in the corridors of time. The concept of bathing, as we understand it today, was viewed with deep suspicion in medieval and early modern Europe. Water was feared as a carrier of disease, and many believed that dirt actually protected the body from illness. This curious logic permeated even the highest echelons of society, creating a culture where the most powerful individuals in the known world lived in conditions that would horrify contemporary sensibilities. Our first monarch takes us to the sun-drenched courts of France, where Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, ruled with absolute authority. Despite his nickname suggesting radiance and brilliance, Louis harbored a secret fear that would define his personal habits for over 7 decades of life. Born into luxury at the Palace of Versailles, surrounded by fountains and gardens of breathtaking beauty, Louis XIV possessed an almost pathological fear of water touching his skin. Historical records suggest that Louis XIV bathed perhaps 3 times in his entire 77 years of life. His courtiers, eager to please their sovereign, adopted similar habits, creating a palace atmosphere that contemporary visitors described as overwhelming to the senses. The Sun King believed that washing removed the body's natural protective oils and invited disease into the pores. Instead of bathing, Louis relied on dry rub-downs with linen cloths, heavy applications of powder, and liberal use of perfumes. The irony was palpable in the halls of Versailles, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on walls adorned with priceless artwork. Yet the air hung heavy with the accumulated scents of unwashed bodies, masked by increasingly potent fragrances. Louis XIV's daily routine involved servants changing his shirt, applying fresh powder to his elaborate wigs, and dousing him with rosewater and other perfumes. This ritual could take over an hour, yet never once included actual washing with soap and water. The Sun King's aversion to bathing extended to his courtiers and family members, creating a culture where cleanliness was seen as eccentric or even dangerous. Madame de Maintenon, his secret wife, once remarked in her private correspondence that the smell of the court was so overwhelming that she often felt faint during lengthy ceremonies. Yet she, like everyone else, dared not suggest that the king's habits were anything less than perfectly reasonable. As we drift deeper into this tale, imagine the grand halls of Versailles, where nobles in their finest silks and brocades moved through elaborate dances, their movements graceful and practiced, while the very air around them told a different story entirely. The contrast between visual splendor and olfactory reality created an atmosphere that foreign dignitaries often found challenging to endure. Louis XIV's courtiers developed elaborate strategies to cope with the aromatic challenges of palace life. They carried small bouquets called tussie-mussies, filled with strong scented herbs and flowers, which they would hold discreetly beneath their noses during formal occasions. The practice became so common that it evolved into a fashion statement, with jeweled holders for these fragrant bouquets becoming status symbols among the nobility. The Sun King's dining habits added another layer to the sensory experience of Versailles. Meals were elaborate affairs lasting several hours, during which the combined effects of rich foods, wine, and the natural aromas of dozens of unwashed bodies created an atmosphere that visitors described as almost intoxicating. Yet the king seemed utterly oblivious to any discomfort, maintaining his regal composure throughout these lengthy ceremonies. Our journey now takes us across the English Channel to the Tudor courts, where we encounter our second monarch, Henry VIII, a king whose legendary appetites extended far beyond food and matrimony. Henry's relationship with cleanliness was complicated by his belief that frequent bathing weakened the constitution and made one susceptible to illness. This belief, common among his contemporaries, was reinforced by the medical advice of his time. Henry VIII's daily routine involved servants scraping dirt and dead skin from his body with special tools, a process that was considered far superior to the dangerous practice of immersing oneself in water. The king owned several elaborate wash basins made of silver and gold, but these were used primarily for washing hands and face, never for full-body bathing. His courtiers followed suit, creating a palace atmosphere that foreign ambassadors often found challenging. The Tudor king's aversion to water was so profound that when he suffered from leg ulcers later in life, his physicians had great difficulty convincing him to allow even medicinal baths. Henry believed that water would somehow seep into his wounds and cause infection, preferring instead to have his injuries dressed with oils and herbs, while keeping them completely dry. This approach, while understandable given the medical knowledge of his time, often exacerbated his health problems. Cardinal Wolsey, one of Henry's closest advisors, once wrote in his private papers about the challenges of conducting business with the king during the warmer months, when the confined spaces of the palace became particularly aromatic. The cardinal described developing headaches during long meetings and eventually learned to request audiences in the palace gardens whenever possible, claiming the fresh air improved his ability to concentrate on matters of state. Henry's wives each had their own approaches to dealing with their husbands' hygiene habits. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, came from the Spanish court, where bathing was more accepted, and she reportedly struggled with the English custom. Anne Boleyn attempted to introduce French bathing practices to the English court, but found resistance not only from Henry but from the established nobility who viewed such innovations with suspicion. The transformation of Henry VIII from a young athletic prince to the corpulent monarch of later years was accompanied by increasingly problematic personal hygiene. His elaborate clothing, designed to display his wealth and power, became prison-like garments that trapped heat and moisture, creating ideal conditions for unpleasant odors. Yet the king's ego would not allow him to acknowledge any discomfort, and his courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths during formal audiences. Court physicians developed increasingly creative explanations for the king's aromatic presence, suggesting that his powerful constitution generated such intense heat that normal human scents were amplified. This pseudo-scientific reasoning allowed everyone to pretend that the situation was not only normal, but actually a sign of Henry's superior royal nature. The courtiers embraced this fiction with enthusiasm, as it allowed them to avoid the dangerous territory of criticizing their volatile monarch. As Henry aged and his health declined, the situation became more challenging for everyone around him. His leg ulcers produced additional unpleasant odors, and his increasing immobility made even basic hygiene more difficult. Yet the elaborate court ceremonies continued, with nobles and servants alike developing strategies to cope with the increasingly difficult conditions while maintaining the fiction that everything was perfectly normal in the Tudor court. Our third royal figure emerges from the mists of Russian history, where Catherine the Great ruled with an iron fist over one of the largest empires the world has ever known. Despite her reputation for enlightenment and cultural sophistication, Catherine harbored personal habits that would seem contradictory to her public image. The Empress, who corresponded with Voltaire and collected some of Europe's finest artwork, maintained a curious relationship with personal cleanliness. Catherine's German origins had exposed her to somewhat more hygiene-conscious practices, but her adoption of Russian customs included embracing the local skepticism toward frequent bathing. The Russian winter climate provided a convenient excuse for avoiding water, as castle heating systems were often inadequate to warm bathing chambers to comfortable temperatures. Catherine rationalized her infrequent bathing as an adaptation to her adopted homeland's practical reality. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, with its hundreds of rooms and countless servants, operated according to routines that prioritized ceremony over comfort. Catherine's daily preparations involved elaborate dress rituals that could take hours, during which servants would change her clothing, arrange her hair, and apply cosmetics and perfumes. Yet actual washing was minimal, typically limited to hands and face with occasionally dampened cloth. Foreign diplomats visiting Catherine's court often remarked in their private correspondence about the contrast between the visual magnificence of Russian royal ceremonies and the olfactory challenges they present. The Marquis de Castine, a French visitor, described in his journals how the brilliant chandeliers and gold leaf decorations of the palace seemed to shimmer in air that was heavy with accumulated human scents masked by incense and perfumes. Catherine's intellectual pursuits provided interesting insights into her personal habits. She was a voracious reader who spent long hours in her private library, often working late into the night on correspondence with European philosophers and writers. Servants reported that these study sessions, sometimes lasting 8 or 10 hours, took place in poorly ventilated rooms where the Empress would become completely absorbed in her work, seemingly oblivious to any physical discomfort. The Empress's famous love affairs took on additional complexity when viewed through the lens of 18th-century hygiene practices. Her numerous romantic relationships required courtiers and servants to develop elaborate protocols for managing the practical aspects of royal romance. In an era when personal cleanliness was not prioritized, perfumes, oils, and strategically placed flowers became essential elements in creating romantic atmospheres that could overcome natural human scents. Catherine's correspondence with European intellectuals occasionally touched on matters of health and hygiene, revealing her beliefs about the relationship between cleanliness and illness. She subscribed to contemporary medical theories, suggesting that the body's natural oils and scents provided protection against disease, and that excessive washing could weaken the constitution. These beliefs, reinforced by her court physicians, provided intellectual justification for her personal practices. The Russian Orthodox Church's influence on court life also shaped attitudes toward bathing and cleanliness. Religious authorities often preached that excessive attention to bodily cleanliness reflected vanity and pride, sins that were particularly dangerous for rulers who were already susceptible to hubris. Catherine, always politically astute, was careful not to appear to reject traditional Russian values in favor of foreign customs that might alienate her subjects. As Catherine aged and her health began to decline, the practical challenges of maintaining even basic hygiene became more pronounced. The Empress suffered from various ailments that made movement difficult, yet she refused to allow servants to assist with personal care beyond the minimum necessary for public appearances. Her pride and need to maintain imperial dignity created situations where basic comfort was sacrificed to preserve royal mystique. The irony of Catherine's situation became apparent in her final years, when she devoted enormous resources to building elaborate bathhouses and spa facilities for her palaces, yet rarely used them herself. These beautiful structures, with their imported marble and sophisticated heating systems, served primarily as showcases for foreign visitors rather than functional facilities for the imperial household. Now our journey takes us to the courts of medieval England, where we encounter Isabella of France, known to history as the She-Wolf of France. Isabella's story intertwines political intrigue with personal habits that reflected the complex relationship between power and cleanliness in the fort. Married to Edward II of England, in a political alliance designed to secure peace between France and England, Isabella found herself in a court where personal hygiene was viewed with the same suspicion as in most European royal households. Isabella's French upbringing had exposed her to slightly more refined approaches to personal care, but her adoption of English court customs included embracing the local attitudes toward bathing. The English nobility of her time believed that frequent washing weakened the body's natural defenses and invited disease. Isabella, eager to fit into her new role as Queen of England, adopted these practices with characteristic determination. The political turmoil of Isabella's reign created additional challenges for maintaining any form of personal comfort. During her conflicts with her husband Edward II and later during her regency for her young son Edward III, Isabella often found herself traveling between castles, living in military camps and residing in temporary accommodations where basic amenities were limited. These circumstances reinforced her practical approach to personal hygiene. Court records from Isabella's time reveal fascinating details about the daily routines of medieval royalty. The Queen's morning preparations involved servants changing her linen undergarments, brushing and arranging her hair, and applying various oils and perfumes to her skin. However, actual washing was minimal, typically involving only face and hands, with full-body cleaning occurring perhaps monthly during warmer seasons and even less frequently during winter. Isabella's legendary strength and determination extended to her apparent indifference to physical discomfort. Contemporary chroniclers noted her ability to endure long journeys, sleep in primitive conditions, and maintain royal dignity under circumstances that would challenge anyone's composure. Her seeming imperviousness to the aromatic challenges of medieval court life became part of her reputation for toughness. The she-wolf's relationship with her husband Edward II was complicated by many factors, including the personal hygiene practices common to their era. Medieval royal marriages were political arrangements that required couples to spend considerable time in close proximity during formal ceremonies, shared meals, and court functions. The practical challenges of these arrangements in an age of limited personal cleanliness required considerable adaptation from all involved. Isabella's later relationship with Roger Mortimer, her lover and political ally, took place against the backdrop of 14th-century hygiene practices that would seem challenging to modern sensibility. Their clandestine meetings required careful planning, not only to avoid political detection, but also to manage the practical aspects of romantic encounters in an era when personal care was minimal. Servants and allies had to develop elaborate protocols for creating private spaces that could be made as comfortable as possible under the circumstance. The Queen's famous invasion of England in 1326, when she returned from France to depose her husband, provides insights into medieval military hygiene. Isabella and her army traveled for weeks through the English countryside, sleeping in tents, eating field rations, and having minimal access to washing facilities. Yet contemporary accounts suggest that the Queen maintained her composure and authority throughout this campaign, apparently unbothered by conditions that would be considered unbearable today. Isabella's court during her regency period reflected the same attitudes toward cleanliness that characterized medieval royal households throughout Europe. The great halls of her palaces were magnificent spaces filled with tapestries, carved furniture, and precious objects. Yet the air was heavy with the accumulated scents of dozens of unwashed courtiers masked by burning herbs, incense, and perfume. Foreign visitors often remarked on this contrast between visual splendor and olfactory challenges. The she-wolf's legacy includes not only her political achievements, but also her embodiment of medieval attitudes toward physical comfort and cleanliness. Her apparent indifference to what we would consider basic hygiene reflected broader cultural values that prioritized spiritual and political concerns over bodily comfort. Isabella's strength lay partly in her ability to transcend physical limitations and focus entirely on her goal. Our fifth monarch brings us to the Holy Roman Empire, where we encounter Ferdinand II, whose reign during the early 17th century coincided with some of the most turbulent periods in European history. Ferdinand's personal habits reflected not only the hygiene practices of his era, but also the specific influences of Habsburg court culture and Catholic religious teachings about the relationship between physical and spiritual purity. Ferdinand II's education had emphasized spiritual development over physical comfort, following Catholic teachings that suggested excessive attention to bodily cleanliness reflected vanity and pride. The Habsburg court, with its emphasis on religious orthodoxy and traditional values, reinforced these attitudes. Ferdinand genuinely believed that his minimal approach to personal hygiene reflected proper Christian humility and rejection of worldly vanity. The Holy Roman Emperor's daily routine reflected these priorities. His morning prayers lasted for hours, during which he would kneel on cold stone floors in unheated chapel spaces, seemingly oblivious to physical discomfort. His personal servants reported that Ferdinand would often emerge from these extended prayer sessions with his clothing damp from perspiration, yet he would proceed directly to court business without changing or washing, viewing such concerns as distractions from more important spiritual and political matters. Ferdinand's court, during the 30 Years' War, operated under extremely challenging conditions. The emperor often resided in military camps or temporary palaces that lacked basic amenities, yet contemporary accounts suggest that Ferdinand maintained his religious routines and court ceremonies even under these difficult circumstances. Apparently unbothered by the accumulated effects of stress, limited facilities and minimal personal care on himself and his courtiers, the emperor's famous religious devotion extended to his attitudes toward physical suffering and discomfort. Ferdinand reportedly viewed the unpleasant aspects of minimal hygiene as forms of penance that brought him closer to spiritual purity. He actively discouraged his courtiers from paying too much attention to personal comfort, viewing such concerns as signs of spiritual weakness that could compromise their effectiveness as servants of the Catholic cause. Ferdinand's marriage to Maria Anna of Bavaria brought together two individuals who shared similar attitudes toward personal cleanliness and physical comfort. Both came from courts where religious devotion took precedence over bodily concerns, and their partnership created an imperial household that operated according to these shared values. Their courtiers learned to adapt to an environment where spiritual priorities dominated all practical considerations. The diplomatic challenges of Ferdinand's reign required him to host numerous foreign dignitaries whose own hygiene practices varied considerably. Protestant rulers from northern European countries often came from courts where bathing was more accepted, creating interesting cultural contrasts during formal ceremonies and negotiations. Ferdinand's staff developed elaborate protocols for managing these cultural differences while maintaining the emperor's commitment to his own standard. Ferdinand II's legacy as a counter-Reformation leader was intertwined with his personal embodiment of Catholic values regarding physical and spiritual purity. His apparent indifference to bodily comfort became part of his reputation for religious sincerity and political determination. Contemporary Catholic writers often praise the emperor's rejection of worldly pleasures, including basic physical comforts, as evidence of his spiritual superiority. The irony of Ferdinand's situation became apparent in the magnificent cathedrals and palaces he commissioned throughout his territory. These structures featured elaborate washing facilities, beautiful bathhouses, and sophisticated water management systems. Yet Ferdinand himself rarely used such amenities. His building projects reflected his commitment to creating spaces worthy of divine worship and imperial dignity, even though his personal habits remained austere. The emperor's final years were marked by increasing health problems that made even basic personal care more challenging. Yet Ferdinand maintained his religious routines and imperial duties with characteristic determination, viewing physical discomfort as opportunities for spiritual growth rather than problems requiring practical solutions. His courtiers learned to provide assistance while maintaining the fiction that the emperor's habits were entirely normal and admirable. Our penultimate monarch transports us to the sophisticated courts of Renaissance Italy, where we encounter Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, whose personal habits created fascinating contrasts with the artistic and intellectual achievements of his era. Alexander VI's papacy coincided with some of the greatest artistic productions in human history, yet his personal relationship with cleanliness reflected medieval attitudes that seemed increasingly anachronistic in the context of Renaissance humanism. Pope Alexander VI's Spanish origins had exposed him to Iberian court customs that were somewhat more accepting of bathing, but his adoption of traditional papal practices included embracing the Church's historical suspicion of excessive attention to bodily cleanliness. The Vatican's official position held that too much concern with physical comfort reflected pride and vanity, sins that were particularly dangerous for spiritual leaders who were supposed to model Christian humility. The papal court, during Alexander VI's reign operated according to elaborate ceremonial protocols that required participants to spend long hours in close proximity during masses, audiences, and formal dinners. The practical challenges of these arrangements, given the hygiene practices of the era, required considerable adaptation from all involved. The burning of incense during religious ceremonies served practical as well as spiritual purposes, helping to mask the accumulated effects of minimal personal cleanliness among dozens of participants. Alexander VI's famous family life, including his relationships with his children Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, took place against the backdrop of Renaissance hygiene practices that would seem challenging to modern sensibility. The papal apartments, despite their magnificent art and furnishings, operated according to the same principles that governed other European royal courts. Personal cleanliness was minimal, and perfumes, oils, and strategically placed flowers were essential for creating comfortable living space. The Pope's legendary political maneuvering required him to host numerous diplomatic receptions, formal banquets, and private meetings with Italian nobles and foreign ambassadors. These events, often lasting many hours and involving dozens of participants, created aromatic challenges that required careful management through the strategic use of perfumes, incense, and ventilation. The papal staff developed elaborate protocols for creating environments that could accommodate the practical realities of Renaissance court life. Alexander VI's patronage of Renaissance art and architecture created interesting paradoxes regarding his personal habits. The Pope commissioned some of the most beautiful frescoes, sculptures, and architectural projects of his era, creating spaces of breathtaking visual beauty. Yet these magnificent environments operated according to hygiene practices that created sensory contrasts that modern observers would find difficult to reconcile. The papal court's religious ceremonies during Alexander VI's reign required participants to wear elaborate vestments made of heavy fabrics and decorated with precious metals and jewels. These ceremonial garments, worn during lengthy masses and formal occasions, created additional challenges for personal comfort in an era when washing of both bodies and clothing was minimal. The Pope and his courtiers developed strategies for managing these practical difficulties while maintaining the dignity required for spiritual leadership. Alexander VI's infamous reputation for worldly pleasures created additional complexities regarding his personal hygiene practices. His enjoyment of elaborate banquets, social gatherings, and romantic relationships had to be balanced with the practical realities of limited personal cleanliness. The papal household staff became expert at creating environments that could support the Pope's active social life, while managing the aromatic challenges inherent in Renaissance court culture. The irony of Alexander VI's papacy lay in his simultaneous commitment to magnificent artistic projects and minimal personal care. The Pope devoted enormous resources to beautifying Rome, commissioning works from the greatest artists of his time, yet maintained personal habits that reflected medieval attitudes toward cleanliness. This contrast embodied the tensions between emerging Renaissance values and traditional medieval practices. The Borgia Pope's final years were marked by increasing political pressures and health problems that made even basic personal care more challenging. Yet Alexander VI maintained his papal duties and social activities with characteristic energy, apparently viewing physical discomfort as a minor inconvenience rather than a significant problem. His ability to transcend practical limitations while pursuing political and artistic goals became part of his complex historical legacy. Our final monarch returns us to the English court, where we encounter Charles II, whose restoration to the throne in 1660 marked the end of Puritan rule and the beginning of a new era of royal excellence. Charles II's personal habits reflected not only the hygiene practices of his era, but also his specific experiences during years of exile and his reaction against the austere practices of the Commonwealth period that had preceded his reign. King Charles II's youth in exile had exposed him to various European court cultures, yet he emerged from these experiences with attitudes toward personal cleanliness that reflected traditional English royal practices rather than any innovation imitations he might have observed abroad. The restored king seemed determined to embrace customs that emphasized the continuity of royal tradition rather than foreign influences that might seem to compromise English sovereignty. The Restoration court under Charles II became famous for its elaborate social life, including frequent balls, theatrical performances, and informal gatherings that brought dozens of courtiers together in relatively confined spaces for extended periods. These social events, central to the king's political strategy of rebuilding royal prestige through magnificent display, created practical challenges that required careful management through the use of perfumes, ventilation, and strategic timing. Charles II's famous relationships with various mistresses, including Nell Gwyn and Barbara Villiers, took place against the backdrop of 17th-century hygiene practices that would seem challenging to modern sensibility. The king's active romantic life required elaborate protocols for creating private spaces that could accommodate the practical realities of intimate relationships in an era when personal cleanliness was minimal. The royal household staff became expert at managing these delicate situations. The Great Fire of London in 1666 and the plague outbreak of 1665 created additional complications for royal hygiene during Charles II's reign. The king's court had to adapt to emergency conditions that made even basic amenities more difficult to maintain, yet Charles insisted on continuing court ceremonies and social activities that required close contact among numerous participants. These circumstances reinforced existing practices of minimal washing, while increasing reliance on perfumes and other masking agents. Charles II's patronage of science and the arts during the Restoration period created interesting contrasts with his personal habit. The king founded the Royal Society and supported scientific investigations that included early studies of medicine and anatomy. Yet his own approach to personal health and hygiene remained rooted in traditional practices that emphasized the dangers of frequent washing and the protective benefits of natural body oils. The restored monarchy's need to demonstrate legitimacy and continuity with pre-Commonwealth traditions influenced every aspect of court life, including personal hygiene practices. Charles II was careful to embrace customs that emphasized his connection to English royal tradition rather than innovations that might seem to reflect foreign influences or republican ideas. His personal habits became symbols of restored royal authority and traditional English value. The king's famous wit and social skills helped him navigate the practical challenges of 17th-century court life with apparent ease. Contemporary observers noted Charles II's ability to maintain royal dignity and personal charm even under circumstances that would challenge anyone's composure. His seeming indifference to physical discomfort became part of his reputation for strength and adaptability. Charles II's later years were marked by increasing health problems that made personal care more challenging, yet the king maintained his active social life and political duties with characteristic determination. His courtiers developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for managing the practical aspects of royal ceremonies and social events while preserving the fiction that everything was perfectly normal and comfortable in the restored English court. The legacy of Charles II's reign includes not only his political achievements in stabilizing the monarchy after the Commonwealth period, but also his embodiment of traditional royal attitudes toward personal comfort and cleanliness. His apparent indifference to what we would consider basic hygiene reflected broader cultural values that prioritized political symbolism and social hierarchy over individual physical comfort. As our journey through the aromatic corridors of royal history draws to a close, we find ourselves with a deeper appreciation for the complex relationships between power, tradition, and personal habits in bygone eras. These 7 monarchs, despite their individual differences in nationality, religion, and historical period, shared common attitudes toward cleanliness that reflected the medical beliefs, religious teachings, and social customs of their times. The paradoxes we have explored tonight reveal fundamental tensions between public magnificence and private reality that characterized royal courts throughout European history. These rulers commanded vast resources, lived in palaces of unprecedented luxury, and wielded power over millions of subjects. yet maintained personal habits that modern observers would find difficult to comprehend or accept. Perhaps most fascinating is the apparent indifference these monarchs showed toward what we would consider basic physical comfort. Their ability to transcend practical limitations while pursuing political goals, artistic patronage, and social activities suggests a different relationship between mind and body than what characterizes contemporary culture. Their focus on spiritual, intellectual, and political concerns often seemed to supersede awareness of physical discomfort entirely. The elaborate strategies developed by courtiers, servants, and diplomatic staff to manage the practical challenges of royal hygiene reveal the creative adaptability of human society. Through perfumes, ventilation systems, strategic timing, and carefully choreographed protocols, entire court cultures learned to function effectively, despite what modern observers would consider significant obstacles to comfort and productivity. These historical examples also illuminate the role of medical beliefs and religious teachings in shaping personal behavior. The widespread conviction that frequent bathing weakened the constitution and invited disease was not mere superstition but reflected the best medical understanding available to these societies. Similarly, religious teachings about the spiritual dangers of excessive attention to bodily comfort provided intellectual frameworks that made minimal hygiene seem not only acceptable, but virtuous. The artistic and architectural achievements that flourished in these aromatic courts remind us that human creativity and intellectual accomplishment can transcend physical circumstances that might seem prohibitive to contemporary sensibility. Some of history's greatest art, literature, music, and architecture emerged from environments where basic hygiene was minimal, suggesting that comfort and cleanliness, while pleasant, may not be essential prerequisites for cultural achievement. The diplomatic challenges faced by these monarchs required them to interact with foreign dignitaries whose own hygiene practices varied considerably, creating cross-cultural encounters that tested everyone's adaptability and social skills. The successful navigation of these challenges demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human societies to develop working relationships despite significant differences in basic lifestyle practices. As we reflect on these tales from history's more aromatic chapters, we might consider how our own cultural assumptions about cleanliness, comfort, and personal care reflect the specific circumstances of our era, rather than universal human value. The monarchs we have encountered tonight were products of their times, adapting to the medical knowledge, religious beliefs, and practical limitations that defined their world. The transformation of European attitudes toward bathing and personal hygiene that occurred during the 18th and 19th centuries represents one of the most dramatic cultural shifts in human history. Yet it happened gradually enough that each generation considered its own practices perfectly normal and reasonable. This reminds us that cultural norms we take for granted today may seem equally strange to future observers. Perhaps there is something to be learned from the apparent contentment these historical figures found, despite living under conditions that would challenge contemporary sensibility. Their focus on relationships, intellectual pursuits, artistic creation, and political achievement suggests that human happiness and fulfillment can emerge from many different lifestyle configurations. The servants, courtiers, and family members who surrounded these aromatic monarchs developed remarkable skills in adaptation and discretion that enabled complex societies to function effectively despite significant practical challenge. Their creativity in developing solutions to olfactory difficulties demonstrates the ingenious problem-solving capacities that emerge when human societies commit to making existing arrangements work rather than seeking fundamental change. The religious and philosophical frameworks that supported minimal hygiene practices in these historical periods provided meaning and dignity to lifestyle choices that might otherwise seem merely uncomfortable or unpleasant. The ability to transform practical limitations into spiritual virtues represents a form of wisdom that transcends specific historical circumstance. As we prepare to drift into peaceful slumber, carried by these gentle tales from history's more aromatic passages, we might appreciate the remarkable diversity of human experience and the countless ways that different societies have organized daily life. The monarchs we have encountered tonight faced challenges we can barely imagine, yet they found ways to create meaningful lives, build lasting institutions, and leave legacies that continue to fascinate us centuries later. The grand palaces where these rulers held court still stand today, their magnificent architecture and artistic treasures testament to the creative achievements that flourished despite what we might consider significant obstacles to comfort and productivity. When we visit these historic sites, we might pause to imagine not only their visual splendor, but also their complete sensory reality as experienced by their original inhabitants. The contrast between the visual magnificence of royal courts and their aromatic characteristics reminds us that historical understanding requires engagement with all aspects of past experience, not merely the elements that align with contemporary preferences. True historical empathy involves appreciating how different societies have defined comfort, cleanliness, and personal dignity according to their own values and circumstances. These stories from royal history ultimately celebrate human adaptability and the remarkable capacity of individuals and societies to find meaning, beauty, and accomplishment under circumstances that might seem challenging to those operating from different cultural assumptions. The 7 monarchs we have encountered tonight represent not merely curiosities from a bygone era, but examples of the diverse ways human beings have organized their lives while pursuing the universal goals of power, love, creativity, and legacy. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you might dream of candlelit halls where silk rustled and gold gleamed, where political intrigue unfolded against backdrops of magnificent art and architecture, and where human beings much like ourselves navigated the complexities of power and relationships according to the wisdom of their times. In these dreams, the aromatic challenges of royal courts might transform into fascinating insights into the endless creativity of human adaptation and the remarkable diversity of ways that different cultures have defined the good life. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle whispers of history and the peaceful knowledge that human beings have always found ways to create beauty, meaning, and dignity under whatever circumstances they have encountered. The royal courts of the past, with all their aromatic complexities, remind us that every era faces its own challenges and develops its own solutions, creating the rich tapestry of human experience that continues to unfold around us today.